the worst crisis in a generation. Not since the 1970s have we experienced an energy emergency on this kind of scale. One, and once again, that is hitting the most vulnerable the hardest. What we actually have is interwoven crises. West's calling it polycrisis, post-pandemic inflation, food insecurity, the climate crisis, and of course the illegal war in Ukraine. Tackling one requires addressing them all. Energy literally fuels the global economy. Providing it in a cost-effective, efficient, equitable, and crucially sustainable manner is a fundamental necessity. Today's short-term decisions must accelerate us towards a secure energy future tomorrow. It requires, as you'll hear today, a massive, massive rise in renewable energy investment, and it has to reach the most vulnerable nations that need it most and simply cannot afford it. The good news, and there is good news, not too serious right now, renewable energy investment did jump in the past year, up 12% from a paltry 2% post the Paris agreements. And also major economies stepped up to provide tangible support. The less good news, we'll call it bad news. Fossil fuel subsidies doubled in 2021 and have probably continued to rise. The industry itself says, look, even if we meet our Paris obligations, oil and gas will still provide for around half of our energy needs in 2040. If that's the case, then that reality requires thoughtful infrastructure investment today. What's more, the lack of diversification that exists in energy supply today exists in clean energy too. Great example, electric car batteries rose 10% in the past year. Cobalt, lithium, nickel, all those prices rose. Like OPEC Plus today, the nations that mine these inputs hold serious playing cards in the future. Energy supply chains have to be strong, diverse, sustainable, or we're simply in danger of swapping one challenge today for another, and that's going to require global cooperation. Finally, our role as consumers. The new energy economy requires significant change from us. The total energy bill paid in the past year, $10 trillion globally for the first time ever. What's more, the top 10% of households consume 20 times the energy of the lowest 10%. The richest nations of the world have proved that they can drop their demand when prices are high. That has to continue as prices come down because it's simply the right thing to do. Whether we like it or not, this is the reality of the new energy economy. Now it's down to us to master the policies that will sustain both the planet and its people. Now, enough of me. Let's talk about this with some of the world's most energetic masters, even at this time in the morning. Martin, I'm going to come to you now for the counterbalance, because we are seeing a rise in investment, which is great, but it's nowhere near enough. And I think Fatih would agree with that. At least today, we need to see a massive rise in investment. And, you know, as he mentioned, if I look at China, if I look at India, if I look at the EU, and we'll hear from the example there, I mean, they have to invest more in wind and solar, because as far as I know, no one's worked out how to turn wind off, and no one's worked out how to turn the sun off, at least, which I think is an important point.
So it's a great story, but of course, we're hopelessly behind. And so let me just set out how I see it. The good news is we all agree that massively expanding the supply of renewable energy is a climate and security priority. This point has been made. And the second piece of good news is that these technologies are increasingly cost competitive.
Right.
And therefore, in economics jargon, they're dominant technologies. That is the most economically efficient things we can do. And that means that over time, if a lot of problems are solved, market forces alone will deliver this. But those forces are, of course, because of the scale of what has to be done, which is not just money, but planning, solving systems reliability problems, solving the developing country finance problems. Finance is a huge issue. The market forces just won't get there in the time needed. All the serious climate scientists tell us that we have to have very sizable reductions in world emissions by 2030 if we're going to have any chance of keeping close to 1.5 degrees, and that's just not on the horizon. It's not what's been happening. So let's not be complacent about it. We need a massive acceleration of the transformation from where we have been, and that will require dramatic changes in policy, serious incentives, serious de-risking of investment across the world, and not just in our own countries. We are not going to solve this problem. Europe generates 10% of emissions in the world. If you include the UK, that's just not relevant to the total picture. So what I want to say is we've got to a more comfortable position technologically and economically than most thought 20 years ago, but we haven't got the world into a more comfortable position, and we should not pretend we are.
It's the technology, we have to take risks. Sometimes the R&D is not going to work, and I know it's tough during a cost of living crisis where you're having to make short-term and longer-term decisions, but I think that points to it. Martin, come in here, because there's two things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the best ways to de-risk finance, whether that's to countries that need it most, that can't afford adaptation finance, never mind mitigation finance. But I think the other thing, we've touched on it here with the subsidies in the United States, and that is creating good competition, not creating protectionism. And I mentioned the dangers of an OPEC plus kind of scenario with some of the minerals like and metals like lithium, like cobalt, like nickel. How concerned are you, one, about insecure new supply chains, but also pushing it so far with subsidies that perhaps we create unhealthy competition, and maybe that's a first-class problem? Martin, how do we overcome these things or get the balance right? And we haven't even mentioned China yet.
Well, my general view, in having watched governments for about half a century and watched climate policy for about 25 years, is that it's always going to be a mess.
Mr. Stickler, get ready to talk.
I don't look for optimality. Or anything vaguely like it. It's going to be wasteful, politicized, but it has to move in the right direction. I don't think we can, when I look at the mess of the nature of our subsidies, what we subsidize, I'm very happy with the subsidies in most of the subsidies in the IRA. God knows why it's called an Inflation Reduction Act, but never mind.
You know why.
Never mind.
Political reasons.
Never mind. Yes, of course I do. But that's the point I'm making. It's going to be political. It's going to be political. But so what one has to do in practice is find a way to marry political realities with moving us very, very rapidly in the right direction.
How?
And I would say so far we haven't done a great job at that. But we haven't done an unbelievably bad one either. So the answer to that, I think, is countries which have a lot of fiscal room, like the US and Europe, just need to be prepared to borrow and spend a lot. And I'm less worried about fiscal deficits than some, so that's what they're going to have to do. But there will be a lot of economic interests pushing them in the right direction because there's a lot of money to be made. So that has made it more even than it was 20 years ago, but it was basically, if I may say so, the fossil fuels industry pushing against it. Now we actually have a renewables energy industry with everything around it, and everybody can see there's money. So this is good, and that will push people, governments further to support them. And that's, I think, part of what happened with the IRA and also with Next Gen EU. But the big hole to me, the biggest hole, is the risk profile in developing and emerging countries. And there's some very good reports recently out on this, the high-level group with Nick Stern and Vera Songway, for example. So there are two elements. First of all, the problem is that nobody wants to lend money to developing and emerging countries, with a very few exceptions, because they think they might not, on cheap terms, because they think they might not get their money back. So they raise interest rates to a level at which they guarantee not to get their money back. Now, this is a real trap. And the only way around that is to de-risk it by the developed countries using the international financial institutions as risk guarantors. And for that to happen, the major IFIs, and here it's the World Bank more than the IFI, have to be prepared to lose quite a lot of money. And that then gets to really big political issues. Who bears ultimately the risks in this system, which has been operating for 60, 70 years on the assumption that essentially they never lose money. So this is there are risks here that have to be borne by someone. And my view is basically it's the rich country governments, because there aren't any other risk bearers. There are lots of other things you can do, equity financing to something, but on the scale that is needed and the speed that is needed, we really have to think about how risk is reallocated and borne in the system if we want this to be a global activity. And remember, emerging and developing countries are where all the growth in energy consumption and emissions are going to come from.
Yeah, the World Bank, in your case in particular, needs to take that first loss piece. They have to be willing to bear the greater proportion of the risk.
But to do that, they have to manage the scale of the losses from their point of view, because they don't want to go back to their shareholders and asking for more capital. But somebody has to take that bite, you know, and say, well, actually, this is so important, we're going to have to risk losing money.
Yeah, the mindset has to change. That has to be clear to the shareholders from the beginning. We're going to throw money at this and we're going to throw money away. Good luck with that.
Well, that's where you get to the point where what is politically feasible may not actually match with what is globally essential. And when you're in that situation, well, political feasibility has to change.
Martin, the floor is yours. You were waving at me to say something, so make it really good, my friend.
So no pressure. So I think the situation is incredibly clear in the sense that we sort of know where we've got to go, and we have to accelerate the speed at which we're going there multiple times.
9 times at least.
9 times.
This will require a staggering volume of resources, a lot of very, very clever policy, and it has to be seen as a global public action program. The first genuinely, as it were, global effort by humanity to manage the world on a war basis.
Right.
That's where we are. And in this situation, to me, the most important thing is that everybody who's involved, politicians, business owners, have the sense of urgency, because so much of this is talking about things as if we had years or decades to sort all these out. We don't. And so the key is to get the urgency. And in my view is, of course, they're going to spend money. A lot of it is going to be wasteful. A lot of the policies that we'll get through will be intensely irritating. But as long as they're pushing really, really rapidly in the main right directions, we'll get there with a lot of luck. And the key things are to look at what isn't happening. Now, what isn't happening is we're not investing nearly enough.
Right.
And 2, we're not investing nearly enough, above all, in the places where we know that's not happening, because they don't have the money.
Right.
And it's no good for us to say we don't have any money, because we're the only people who do have any in this situation, and we've got to do something. That's how it is.
Yeah, and citizens have to take responsibility.